Welcome to the Wizard and the Bruiser. Get on! Oh, the blood's everywhere. I am the Wizard, Jake Young.
And I'm the Bruiser, the fun big bruiser, Holden McNeely.
And we are your weekly delve into the nightmarish history of all of your favorite nerd shit. And this week we got a little bit of a hype train going. We got a taste of The Last of Us Part 2.
Yes.
Not The Last of Us 2, The Last of Us 1 Part 2, idiots. What, you thought that story had a complete and satisfying ending? You're dumb.
Yeah, I was I was shocked a little bit that I shouldn't have been shocked, but I really did feel like it stood on its own. But either way, that's fine. I'll play another one. I'll definitely play another one with an older Ellie. Ellie? Ellie.
That's yeah. There's one thing I'm looking for. It's a lesbian survivalist zombie apocalypse game. That wasn't a joke. That fucking sounds rad.
That sounds pretty kick-ass. But of course, today's episode is about the famous game dev company, Naughty Dog.
Now, I feel like one of the weirdest things that Naughty Dog kind of inhabits in the game space is that they produce these AAA level games on a first-party basis for Sony. Like, ever since the PlayStation 1, they have just been churning out these top-tier, what are they called? The PlayStation Classics? Like, the things
Yeah, PlayStation Classics, instant PlayStation Classics, in a way that fully utilizes the software to the point where it's mind-boggling, especially with the game we'll get to later, Uncharted 4. But it's like they seem to kind of, know the secret to how to utilize every console to its fullest extent.
Not every console, just goddamn Sony consoles.
Just PlayStations, just every time PlayStation consoles.
And the same way that you think of Nintendo as having these premium, once-in-a-lifetime experiences, Sony never quite had that, but they had Naughty Dog. And as we're going to go into it, Naughty Dog just kind of saw... That is Naughty Dog's entire... history is kind of about filling niches and seeing where the game industry is going to go and pulling it off impeccably.
And making something that's just perfect for the time. But let's take a little trip into the way, way back machine. Tron's a movie during this time.
PC gaming in the 1980s. PC gaming on the 1980s. 10 frames a second. Most of it sucks.
God save the Queen. It's 1984. I don't remember if that song came out any time around that time period, but we're starting there, 1984, 2 years after the birth of a little boy named Holden McNeely. They were an independent developer named Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin. They created a game called Math Jam.
So here's the thing you have to understand about the founders of Naughty Dog, Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin. As always, it keeps coming back to one's got the technical know-how and one's got the big dick razzle-dazzle.
Yeah, one's the cool bro dude who likes surfboards and roller skates. The other guy sits alone and sad, and he's just hammering away at the keyboard.
So the
which one is us in that department?
I feel like we each got a bit of both.
Okay. Yeah, I'd say I'm kind of a rock and roll sad boy.
I'm like a Gygax and a Waz. I'm the fat one. There's always a fat one, and in this one there was also a fat one, and that was Andy Gavin. So Jason Rubin, Andy Gavin, two nice Jewish boys with rich ass parents, so they were able to afford PCs personal computers in the 1980s, which at the time were severely underpowered. They weren't standardized. So if you wanted to make a game for the Apple II, it wouldn't run on anything else. It wouldn't even run on later Apple IIs. Everything had to be super, specifically ported, which resulted in a lot of shitty games.
Yes.
But it also meant that...
It was called a budgetware.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It also meant, though, that very small teams could make hit software because the each individual niche was so desperate for content.
Yes, they were working with the programming languages Lisp and C++. They named their company probably based on the name of their first game. They called it Jam Software originally.
Do you know what it stood for?
Um,
Jason and Andy's Magic.
Oh, I'm so happy you knew that fact.
No,
That's
I got
amazing.
this is maybe,
no shit. They changed it later on.
This might be my favorite part of the story is the early years because
The
these
ski
aren't
game?
like these
I'm
aren't
excited
two
about the
these
ski
are
game.
kids. These are literally 14-year-old, 15-year-old children making these games out of like a hobby. And the split of divide was Jason Rubin was the cool art director guy. And Andy Gavin was the coder that could like heavily optimize the games to run way smoother than other games on this very limited hardware.
And Gavin, the crazy, klutzy, nerdy one, they were working on a game, a skiing game. Well, one day, Gavin accidentally copied bootleg games over the only copy of the ski game they had. So then he had to rewrite the entire game and named it Ski Craze within the weekend. And then they put it out. I watched gameplay footage, man. This game is trash.
Yeah. It's
in the
PC
best
gaming
way.
in the 1980s. It's all trash.
Yes.
It's like the only games that are even remotely compelling are like text-based adventure games because there's nothing to like scroll by at like 2 frames a second. This is also super key to understanding Naughty Dog is Gavin, like straight-laced, focused, good programmer. Jason Rubin, party dog. Like when you like the name Naughty Dog is all Jason Rubin. And he was the art director for all of their collaborations. And his drawing style is the most 1990s, 80s teenager I've ever seen in my entire life. It's all like radical, ugly dudes, like with weird face proportions. If you go online, you can find. Actually, in Crash, you could see the Naughty Dog original face logo. It is a grotesque, like homunculus of gross shit. I just seeing his drawings and seeing their artwork from that era, I flashed back so hard to like my own school notebooks.
And their games are, I mean, Dream Zone in 1988, an adventure game where the player becomes trapped in his own dream because of a scientist's elixir and must escape it. Also, man, look up gameplay footage of Keef the Thief. Woo, that is ugly, man.
Yeah,
it
yeah.
is. I don't know. I appreciate so much whenever I see any prolific artist of any kind's early work, and it's just trash. It makes me feel so good, you know?
But here's the
because
thing.
I put out a lot of trash, and I still put out a lot of trash, so I'm just, it gives me hope, Jake.
We talked in the Cartoon Network episode, though, we talked about how in the 80s and 90s, this ugly aesthetic was cool.
That's true, yeah.
So even though at the time, even though now we're like, oh, this is the most eye-gougingly awful-looking thing I've ever seen in my life, at the time, I'm sure old suits were like, you got a lot of chutzpah, kid. I like the way this looks. So they had a lot of early success, especially for a 2-person underage team, and
Totally.
they got picked up by Electronic Arts, which, they weren't like as monolithic, but they were a video game publisher. So Jam started signing up with EA as under Naughty Dog.
Yeah, to get away from Vaudeville, which was the publisher they were working with before, and we'll actually see this happen later on, too. They're constantly sort of getting away from the old publisher and moving on to the new publisher, but so they have to make changes. In this situation, that change was their name from Jam Software to Naughty Dog.
Now, do you know the lore about how they got signed with EA?
No, sir.
So, they're hot shots. They'd been selling a few games on their own. EA brought them in to tour the studios, or, the offices. And very casually, they come across what looks like a reverse-engineered, hacked version of the then newly released Sega Genesis. Actually, there's actually a lot of crossover between the Naughty Dog story and the Sega story, going all the way back to episode 1 of Wizard and the Bruiser. But that is illegal. That, in fact, was a prototype that EA was using that they would eventually use to bypass Sega's copy protection for the Genesis. And EA had a whole run of these semi-bootleg, unofficial sports games and other releases that they released for the Genesis without paying the licensing fee. There was like a lawsuit. It's a part of video game lore how EA tried to.
I'm pretty sure we're going to do a whole episode on EA at some point.
But Jason Rubin, seeing this in the middle of EA's offices, was like, hey, quick question. What the fuck is that bullshit? And the EA rep was like,
He's like, this bullshit? This is some fucking bullshit right here.
and EA was like, haha, funny story. How would you like a publishing contract and 7 non-disclosure agreements about what the fuck you just saw? So they got the deal to make a Genesis game
Called
for EA.
Rings of Power in 1991. Is that the game you were talking about?
And
Yes.
this game has a very big cult.
Still has a following.
Yeah. It's one of those things. I feel like most Western RPGs before the 32-bit era just is almost the graphics and everything are too simple and the gameplay systems are too complex that I just never got around to it.
Right.
If you really want to beat your dick against a wall, try and play
Hey, I couldn't tell you how many times I've beaten my penis against a wall, but let's move on to the Rings of Power, Jake, please.
So it's a very it's a very complicated Western RPG with various classes and what they claimed at the time was the biggest game world ever conceived.
Over 100 NPCs. I looked at a little quick play earlier. Really enjoyed it. It looked like a fun game. I think a lot of the draw of it was a lot more like adventure RPGs that were happening on PC at the time, but this was, of course, on console. Therefore, you could kind of scratch that itch on console, which was kind of nice. And really, I was looking at it, and I was a Sega Genesis owner. I wasn't really into that type of game back in the day, but it was definitely one of those games where I was like, man, I kind of wish I'd played this. This looks really cool and complex in a simple way, displayed way, though. Kind of.
But issues came up in production, and EA, despite the fact that Jason and Andy were very proud of this game and poured their heart and soul into it, it was the culmination of this this love of game making that they had fostered throughout their youth. The production for the cartridges was too expensive, and EA decided to cut it off and use the available production capacity to make more Madden games. In addition to all the fuckery of the copy protection controversy, which I swear I used to know a lot about, but that was months ago when we were researching Sega stuff, and it all just flushes down the toilet.
My God, I have the worst memory of John Madden football for the Sega Genesis. I think it was Madden 94. My brother, I would Hail Mary the ball down the field for a touchdown every single time. I used to play with my brother who would force me to play with him, and every time I scored a touchdown, which was pretty much every time I got the ball, he would punch me really hard in the arm.
Oh, not like a corrective, you old son of a gun.
No.
Full swing.
By the end, I was seeing sparks, and my arm was just throbbing.
Oh, that's abuse.
Yes. So that's why I think I don't like playing competitive games. I don't like it's like a Pavlovian thing. If I win a competitive game, I feel bad.
I'm still scared of teenagers on the subway holding basketballs because I think they're going to go, think fast, and throw it at my head. Even though I don't know them. I'm just conditioned that if someone's holding a basketball, it might go flying at my head.
That's why I always, if I get on a subway train and someone's holding a basketball, especially if it's a kid, I point at them and say, don't fucking do it. And then I sit down and I mumble to myself for the rest of the trip. But, of course, we should probably return to the situation.
No. So this situation. Okay, so the fiasco with Rings of Power.
What can we talk about? We're getting to Way of the Warrior, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm very excited about Way of the Warrior.
Soured them on the idea of cartridge-based media, which means they were they did not care about Nintendo, they did not care about Sega, and the two of them had a brief falling out where they went their separate ways and went to college and at grad school. Andy Gavin was actually studying at MIT.
Oh, wow.
And his father was actively telling him to get out of game development because it's a waste of his talent as a programmer and that he has a whole future ahead of him that he's, has to foster and put away the childish things. But they couldn't keep the creativity and the charisma of Jason and Andy together, which is why noticing that Mortal Kombat was a big hit and that fighting games were just basically printing money, they independently produced a game of their own for the 3DO, which had just come out.
Which was, of course, destined to be a giant success.
Discs, the exact thing. The exact thing that broke their hearts earlier, cartridge, was a thing of the past.
Yep.
Now there's disc-based games that you can print forever for cheap. It solves so many problems. Your games can have videos, and they can look so much better than anyone else's games. And in that early 3DO CDI era, there wasn't that many games for CD-based media.
No,
it was
not
actually,
at all.
So this is where their kind of modus operandi. They saw a need. They saw a CD-based fighting game needed to happen. It's both.
It's so good. I realized, Jake, I love Mortal Kombat knockoffs. Like it's like a new thing I've learned this year. I've been obsessed with Tattoo Assassins, which never actually really came out. But look up fatalities for Tattoo Assassins.
Primal Rage 1 and 2.
Primal Rage 1 and 2. Catfight.
I never saw Catfight.
Oh, it is so bad. And dude, I had never heard of Way of the Warrior. Do yourself a favor. Go on YouTube. They've got all the fatalities. It is such a Mortal Kombat knockoff. I think it's more egregious than any other Mortal Kombat knockoff I've ever seen, with the Australian fighter Shaky Jake and Nicky Chan. And all of the voice acting is so, like, hilariously lazy. Like, I don't know what it was about voice acting.
Everything about that game is lazy.
Yeah, it's like there's a character called Ninja, and this was just one of the voice acting bits. Like they'll say a little quip when they do the fatality, and Ninja goes reverse harikari. And he like literally says like it's reverse harikari, but it's just like he literally like they woke him up out of a sleep and was like put a microphone. It's like just say reverse harikari. Reverse harikari. It's so crazy.
All the the key to a Mortal Kombat style fighting game is that they use photograph based sprites rather than 2D like drawn sprites.
Yes.
And the actual footage, the actual fighting characters you see in Way of the Warrior is Jason and like some of his gym buddies.
Whoa.
And like other randos that he brought in, and they were photographed in his apartment.
Yeah, that makes so much sense.
Because this is a janky looking game.
Oh, mama, is it janky. And it is hilarious. It is so great to watch. It's just, there's literally a guy who's just straight up dressed like Louis Kang, but he's just like a little more overweight and like tired.
They have like those scorpion, like Sub-Zero ninja type characters, but you can clearly tell that he's just wearing a bandana over his mouth. Like not a ninja mask. Like he's just has a patterned bandana across his face.
So incredulously, they present this to Mark Cerny of Universal Interactive Studios.
Mark Cerny, dear God, his whole story.
What's his story?
Well, if you're listening to this and you're a fan of video games, you know already that Mark Cerny is this legendary figure. He started way back when he was 17. He worked for Atari. He created Marble Madness.
Oh, my God.
He ended up working for Sega, and he was part of the team that made games for the original Master System, the Genesis, Kid Chameleon, Sonic the Hedgehog 2.
I love Kid Chameleon.
Yeah.
Sonic 2. That's like the best game on the Genesis. I know it sounds like I'm like playing along like I don't know any of this, but I really don't know any of this, Jake.
We're going to get into his work with Naughty Dog, which is very extensive, but he also created Spyro the Dragon for Universal. He helped design the PlayStation 4's architecture.
Whoa.
He was
so he's still like
he is still
alive
incredibly
and
active.
and kicking. Yeah.
Two things you need to know about Mark Cerny. Number one, he is an incredibly talented programmer with an innate understanding of how to produce video games and how achieving graphical flourishes that previously were thought impossible is a huge selling point for video games. And so a lot of his talent is unearthing the capabilities of individual hardware to kind of like raise awareness and catch the eye.
Well, that's really interesting because that really goes completely parallel with Naughty Dog's essentially whole career arc, starting with Crash
Number
Bandicoot. 2,
real weirdo. Like, I don't want to insult.
Like piss in jars.
I just like
weirdo,
if you watch. I've been watching a lot of interviews with him, and from 1996 or whatever to all the way to 2016, he barely aged. He always has like a very goofy haircut, and he has a very, very like calming yet unsettlingly robotic way of speaking that just really makes you think he's going to snap at any second, but while he's still calm, it's very friendly and engaging, but there is a darkness behind it that I can't quite place.
That was amazing,
yeah,
Jake.
It's Mark Cerny's a very fascinating guy. So if there was ever a guy to see your shitty Mortal Kombat game for CD, or no, I'm sorry, for 3DO.
And find the potential in it somehow. Because, I mean, when I watched it earlier, I was like, what is this trash? I can't believe this trash exists. I can't believe this trash is by the same people who made the Crash Bandicoot series and then the Uncharted and Last of Us series.
It was also a big risk for the Jason and Andy to take their completed game they made independently without a publisher take it to a game convention to show to publishers. That really wasn't how it was done back then. Now with the indie game scene, there's companies like Devolver Digital that will like find like rare, diamonds in the rough and like elevate them. But at the time, you just had to like get hired for a publisher and then hope that like that publisher would accept your pitch.
Right, or essentially just start as like a little weasel in the company and sort of work your way up, to being able to just pitch ideas. So
they saw the niche. They out of their own like drive, they made the game, and then they had the balls to show it to people. Which, if you see footage of Way of Warrior, that takes balls to show to people.
Yeah, for sure.
And Mark Cerny took the bait. He was working for Universal Games, which was a big publisher at the time, and they
signed them on for a 3-game deal, which is another, I feel like, huge deal.
Yeah.
To get signed on. And that's when they, of course, went in development for what would become Crash Bandicoot.
Naughty Dog was set up literally on the Universal Studios lot. It's like they got the money, they got the support. It was a classic 90s young kids got rich as fuck.
It's pretty incredible, and this is when we kind of see what you were talking about with the trend of them noticing what the trends were around them and adapting to that, so that they saw that shooters and fighting games were all transitioning to 3D, and they decided, hey, why don't we bring that to the platformer? And that was kind of where the whole Sonic the Hedgehog thing came from. And what I love, the thought that is really interesting to me is back then, they didn't really know, now the 3D platformer is so commonplace. I mean, we're about, with Crash Bandicoot and Spyro and, obviously Mario 64 and all these games that the doors were blown open and that became the standard. But at the time, these are people sitting in a room saying, what does Sonic the Hedgehog in 3D look like?
Right.
And they actually used it was codenamed Sonic's Ass Game, because it was literally joking around about how we would be looking at the main character from the viewpoint of looking at its ass as it ran, into the background.
And as the game picked up steam, they understood the power of the mascot with Sega, as we discussed in the Sonic episode, Sonic becoming a national, worldwide known brand within a year on the strength of the character design and the attitude.
Yep. Lots of tude, buddy.
Lots of tude.
And Crash had some fucking tude.
And they got Sony to really support the game because
Sony needed it.
Sony needed it. Mario 64 was out, and this PlayStation didn't have a mascot.
PlayStation was also not.
They did have Mr. Polygon, which, if you look up, is a terrifying demon face that they thought maybe would be cool, but it's not, because it's a terrifying demon face.
So, yeah, it's like, you have to remember, too, PlayStation is in kind of the same situation Naughty Dog's in at this point in history. They don't have the namesake. They're brand new. They're being looked at like, you guys... Really? You're also going to make a console? Are you serious? To compete with Sega and Nintendo? Are you out of your fucking mind? I mean, that's, until people got their hands on those consoles and realized that this was actually legit, I mean, they were looked at just like any other one of those kind of throwaway consoles that came before, like Jaguar and whatnot, stuff like that. I mean, they had to prove themselves, and so they really were looking towards Crash to be that flagship mascot that at the time all consoles really needed. And I also want to say, before we get into the Crash stuff, they did have to throw out their previous game, which was Allosaurus and Deinstein.
I did not hear about this.
It is a side-scroller based on time-traveling scientists who were genetically merged with dinosaurs. So I think that was a good move on their part.
That's terrifying. So Crash, the mascot, took a lot of work and took a lot of testing. They actually produced their own independent animated short to prove to Sony that the character could support his own merchandising and TV shows. There's a song sung by Jim Cummings, who did the voice of Tigger and is like this amazing classic voice actor guy. So the character of Crash was just as developed as the rest of the game because they pitched to Sony that, like, you don't understand. You need a Sonic. We're making the Sonic. He can be in toys. He can be in commercials. We're talking Happy Meals. You need us.
And they studied it like scientists. They were like, we need a character that is cute, real, and no one really knows about. That's the kind of animal we need. So they looked up different types of mammals from Australia, wombats, potaroos, and bandicoots were the options they went with.
That's it's from the echidna school of, well, if it's a barely known mammal, it could look like anything. They even produced their own independent animated short by the same animation company that made like Animaniacs and Freakazoid.
Which makes so much sense because Dr. Neo Cortex, the main villain, was heavily based off of Pinky from Pinky and the Brain.
Right.
And his sidekick minions were resembling the Weasel characters from Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
So they actually made this cartoon short with the voice of Jim Cummings, who is this legendary voice actor who's done like the voice of Tigger and like half of the cartoon characters you've ever known. Guest super producer Megan, could you please play a clip of that just so people understand what's happening?
Dr. Cortex is a genius, a mental aberration. He's totally fixated on world domination. The local island creatures are dull and obtuse. Until the evil doctor turns on the juice, he wants them for his troops. They come out nincompoops, most especially
Wait.
Crash Bandicoot. Should have been a genius, but he doesn't quite compute. Crash Bandicoot. Anything can happen now that Crash is in pursuit.
So
John has been selected
they
for
were
running through
really
the
banking on a multimedia franchise. Like, do you want, like, they were like, guys, listen, Shuhei Yoshida, guess what? We got an orange animal in jean shorts. Pay us.
Yeah, they really went all the way. And also for the music, they got Mark Mothersbaugh's company, Mutado Musica, to do the soundtrack. He got this guy Josh Mansell, who was known for Johnny Mnemonic's The Interactive Movie, to do all the music. It was an urban chaotic symphony was the description they went with. And Mark Mothersbaugh would end up being, of course, from Devo, and who did the soundtrack to so many.
The theme to Rugrats, to so many movies.
So much stuff, and he had a lot of interaction with the whole Crash Bandicoot soundtrack through all the games, actually. Yeah. So
in addition to all of this, the game itself, with the programming might of Cerny and Gavin, ran beautifully on the PlayStation.
Yes.
They found extra power like wherever they could in the memory mapping, in the textures, in like they got every ounce of available power that people thought could happen on the PlayStation.
And I remember playing this game on a demo stand in a Blockbuster and thinking to myself, "Holy shit. This is the new thing. This is it. This is what it looks like, you know?"
One of the this is just there's so many simple tricks that they did. But, for example, Mario used what people like to call skeletal animation, where it's just individual pieces kind of moving on a rig, while Crash used a much more difficult-to-program way of animating called vertex animation, where the individual points where the polygons meet are manipulated, which, even though it's harder, gave Crash so much more expression. The fact that his face morphed and that his ears would dip and all this, it was very expressive. He would react to what's happening on screen, and when he died, he would make all these different animations. Conveyed a lot of that attitude, a lot of that cartoony feel that even the N64 at the time wasn't able to produce.
Yes, absolutely.
So Sony has this in their hands, knows that it's a glaring weakness in their own lineup that they don't have a cartoony platformer. So they give Crash Bandicoot front row center, featuring on all advertisements at conventions.
And I loved those advertisements with Crash Bandicoot showing up with the big bullhorn at the Nintendo offices. And you know what I loved so much about the character was, instead of Nintendo and like Sonic, he's edgy or whatever, Crash was like silly. Crash was like a different thing. It wasn't like, I'm so edgy. It was more like, I'm a goof bag. I'm ridiculous. I'm just
My
gonna
girlfriend has giant hooters.
Yeah, whatever.
Tana, they got rid of her very quickly. The bigwigs at Universal were uncomfortable with the size of the Bandicoot girlfriend's bosoms.
It definitely confused me. Definitely created a lot of furries. But yeah, he just had a really cool vibe, like a new vibe that was kind of goofy and fun and self-deprecating. I think that was the important part, the self-deprecating vibe of him. He was like, I'm going to take you down, Nintendo. I'm also a ridiculous Bandicoot-ass moron,
The game sells like gangbusters.
6.8 million copies on the PlayStation, the one of the highest selling titles for the PlayStation console.
And because it was one of the PlayStation's essential titles, kind of like Mario 64, kind of like Sonic the Hedgehog, it was just a consistent hit and source of revenue for the company.
Absolutely.
And, they were this young team with all this money and all this hype and all this support from their backers. So, like, I watched old PlayStation Underground videos, which was like,
yeah, those are great.
And you could tell just how rich they were getting, because Jason Rubin would like drive up in a Ferrari and be like, "Hey guys, want to see what we're working on Crash 2?"
Yeah, totally. And Crash 2 was fantastic. It was. Man, I just remember getting it and playing it all night. I absolutely loved it. They just really kind of improved upon what they had already had going. My only complaint was it was too short. I remember I pretty much had almost beaten it in one evening. And I was like, damn it, because those games were expensive back then.
I was a precious Nintendo boy. I actually never touched any Crash games.
I was 100% Sega Genesis and then made the jump to PlayStation. I was like...
You were way cooler than me.
Way into that shit. And so, yeah, Crash 2 was great. Crash 3 Warped was fantastic. They actually made 3 new engines for that game in company. 3 engines so that they could do the jet ski and airplane levels and combine that with the engine they had already running. So... and that was all done by Gavin, and also with Stephen White and Greg Omi. Those are the programmers. So, like, literally, they're creating programming languages, or they're creating game engines in-house to, like, just break new barriers and up the ante. And, I mean, all of these games, by the way, and all the games we're about to talk about, incredibly well received, incredibly well reviewed, sold insanely well, very few complaints about any of this stuff. Even their Mario Kart ripoff, Crash Team Racing, is considered to be a fantastic kart game.
Crash Team Racing is like almost more well received than the rest of the Crash series, because like the Crash series is beautiful and a great piece of 32-bit gaming history, but like it's a little stiff. It's like it has its peaks and valleys in terms of gameplay, but
for sure.
They never got past the peak of Crash 1. There were diminishing returns on the Crash series, and when it was time to update to the PlayStation 2 hardware, they decided to start anew with a new franchise.
Yes, and this is another situation of they had to make some changes in order to get away from certain companies. So before, it was changing their name from Jam to Naughty Dog, and this time they had to let go of the Crash franchise, which was probably a really good thing for them. In order for them to stop working with Universal, they wanted to get away from Universal. Sony bought them up, and the downside of that was they had to change IPs to something new and get away from Crash, which I think was actually, again, like I said, worked in their favor. So they started working on a little-known game called Jak and Daxter for the PlayStation 2. Another, by the way, interesting thing about Naughty Dog in general, they really only stick with one IP for every console generation.
I've noticed that.
Very interesting. Until Last of Us was announced, they were 100% the same IP, or one certain IP for each console generation. Really bizarre.
So Jak and Daxter took a lot of what they learned from Crash Bandicoot and kind of expanded on it. Instead of narrow kind of like hallway-like levels, it was a stretching open world that would load in real time. It was like very smooth and fluid. There were very little, a lot less loading screens. The animation would actually was very stretch and squashy. It was very organic feeling. It was very lush.
Inspiration for the two main characters from manga and Disney animation.
Oh God, no! Original Jack design looks like every I swear to God, like Jason Rubin's character work just reminds me so much of my own high school like notebook. Like Jack looks like every single like bad anime drawing that every white kid ever made. I got a shoulder pad, goggles, and my hair is 8 feet tall. Right. Anime.
Now, they built a new engine for that as well. They created from the ground up, which was unusual for most games. It was invented, Naughty Dog. Oh, this was what was unusual. They invented a new programming language that was termed Goal, which was only ever used for the Jak and Daxter series. It was, in the sense of it being an open world platformer, it was a huge step up. Now, Jake, I think one of my biggest, kind of curiosities about getting into doing a story about Naughty Dog was we have Crash Bandicoot and then we have Last of Us, right? And Uncharted. And I was just wondering, like, how the fuck did we go from Crash Bandicoot to Uncharted? And I think that I found the answer. And the answer lies in Jak and Daxter 2. In a huge way, because it's sort of, this is when it turned from a bright, fun, like silly romp cartoon character kind of platformer to like a dark, gritty cartoon platformer.
I mean, by like Jak and Daxter 3, he had machine guns and was stealing cars. Yeah. And this actually lines up with the fact that at this point in our story, our good friends, the very rich Jewish teenagers who did right, Jason and Andy, part ways with the company. They go on to start a very dumb mid-2000s startup called Flector, and it failed miserably, but who cares? They're rich.
There you go.
They've since found success in other realms of the gaming sphere. I think one of them works for Oculus now.
Nice.
But they were like, you know what? We're done. We're leaving. We're going to make even more money somewhere else. And they left the company in the hands of Evan Wells and a very nice foreign-sounding man called Christoph Balestra, along with other staff members like Neil Druckmann and Bruce Straley. And
Druckmann is a huge figure in Last of Us,
right?
Which we'll talk about soon.
And these are younger guys who didn't grow up in the 80s PC gaming. These are people that were in love with gaming as it was now, and gaming, or now, when PlayStation 2 was around.
Yeah.
And the hit games that they were obsessed with were games like Grand Theft Auto and Call of Duty and all these like violent, mature games. The cartoony vibe, the age of like Sonic the Hedgehog was like dead in the water by this point.
It got so dark and so gritty around that time. It was like a little, that had to, we had to kind of turn the corner on that. And what's funny is actually, which we'll get to in a second, Uncharted actually did try to turn the corner in a little bit on that, with having more vibrant, more vibrant look. Now, I love this quote from Eurogamer about the Jak and Daxter series, and that is, the Jak and Daxter series remains a fascinating document of the evolution of the action-adventure genre. Its heroes are unstuck in time without a genre to call home. No series has been so willing to switch gameplay styles with such reckless abandon, and the Jak and Daxter trilogy represents a shining example of what happens when a capable developer takes a huge risk. Now, the reason why that is because the producers were kept away from the creative side. In other words, the business side of things were sort of kept as far away from the creators as possible to allow them to do their thing. And I'm going to do another quote here from Keith Guerrette, who was the visual effects artist for Uncharted and Last of Us. He says, "It comes with a lot of pros and cons, but I think it definitely is one of our biggest strengths. Looking around at the rest of the industry, and this is something that we do talk about quite a bit, the companies that are doing really innovative, cool things are all the ones that don't have the management, like the business side, directly injected into the company. Sony's put us in this fantastic position where we don't have any producers. We don't have any interactions with Sony corporate at all on the development."
I was watching a retrospective about Naughty Dog, and they talked about how much they valued, there were staff members, and how much they loved the culture there. That it did have this leftover, like, 90s punk rocky kind of feel to it. They mentioned a tradition they have of the dog collar. which is a literal dog collar that is kept in the office that, when worn, the wearer can say whatever they want to anybody in the company and not be fired for it.
Wow, what? That's fucking amazing. So after Jak and Daxter, they're sort of put in this position where they want to move on. They want to move on from cartoony looks.
Mm-hmm.
They want to get into some like real human looking, and they know it's the time because with the PlayStation 3 they now realize they can make humans look like humans and environments look real. So this is when they go full bore into the sort of just straight up, action adventure film like look.
They also were aware from growing with Jak and Daxter that the era of like the silent protagonist, the kind of cipher character, isn't as appealing at that moment as a cool character that the player can like aspire to and like project onto, more so than just embody.
And we can't talk about Uncharted and these types of decisions without highlighting Amy Hennig, who was the writer and director for the Uncharted series. She kind of worked her way up, starting with the Jak games. Her first game was Michael Jordan Chaos in the Windy City. But then she was assisted on Blood Omen Legacy of Kain, and then was director, producer, and writer for Soul Reaver, which is a huge title.
Hey, Holden, were you into Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, the vampire, moody, emo, lore-heavy action series?
It was really weird. I played it a lot. And at the same time, I was like, I don't even know why I am playing this. But I like it.
It's because he had no lower jaw, so when he pulled down his scarf to eat someone's soul, there was just a rad fucking neck wound that it gets sucked into.
I remember, I loved huge parts about it, but I didn't like... What's interesting is a lot of the things I didn't like about it, Amy made a point of not having in the Uncharted series, and it was like way too dark and brooding, kind of like you described, whereas the Uncharted series, she really wanted to make lush, beautiful environments to contrast what other games were doing at the time. And it's a reason why I am a huge proponent for Witcher 3, because Witcher 3 is like Skyrim, but it's not all fucking dark and like bummed out, which was kind of a thing I didn't like about Skyrim, is like the world is so dark and so like overbearing, and I really appreciated that we can have blood and crazy violence and insane dark storylines, but contrasted with like a beautiful lush environment that I can really like take in and breathe in and like fall in love with.
Now, people working for Naughty Dog actually consider the development of Uncharted to be the dark days. There was a lot of conflict. It was very expensive.
Management changes are always difficult.
Naughty Dog, between Jak and Daxter and Crash, had fostered this world-class games animation team, and instead of utilizing them, they decided to go with the new technology of mocap, which, very famously, Nolan North in the ping pong ball suit, delivering the performances and actually acting out all the action.
Nolan North, of course, the voice of Nathan Drake, the main character in the entire Uncharted series. Beloved main character.
Actually incorporating that data in a way that flowed naturally proved to be a nightmarish system, because a human stride doesn't respond as quickly as a flick of a thumbstick. So, they had to redo and scrap the animation system. The PlayStation 3 notoriously is insanely hard to program for
Very
because of the
difficult.
cell processor.
They had to there were a lot of starts and stops for the process. They had to completely scrap giant chunks and reprogram giant chunks just because it was so damn hard to program for the PlayStation 3, which is why a huge reason why it fell behind in the console wars of that time to the 360.
And given the time, given the expense, given the heartbreak that it took to create Uncharted, the original Uncharted, it didn't actually sell. Like, it did okay, but it wasn't a hit. It wasn't like a runaway, like, kaboom, like Crash Bandicoot. They didn't hit it out of the park.
No, no, not at all. And at the same time, it definitely laid a foundation, right?
Right.
For sure.
Because after the game went out, usually they take a break of a month. That was another part of Naughty Dog's like cool corporate policies, is they would take long breaks after each project was done to kind of recenter and find themselves. They started working on Uncharted 2 immediately. And the first footage that they showed off was at E3, and it was the collapsing building set piece.
So good.
And that's what started
so
blowing
good.
people away. It was Uncharted as the set piece, as the action movie you were controlling. It was cutscenes, but you were in it.
And as the Boston Globe put it, no video game has ever done a better job of capturing the style and rhythm of the movies. And, of course, Amy Hennig, much like Kojima himself, was a film school dropout off of kind of a fluke, ended up working on a game. God, what was the stupid name of that game? Electro Cop for the Atari. And she ended up making the switch to video games through working as an artist on that game. That inspired her to kind of move over. And so, of course, you've got this film major, this person who was going to make movies, and now they're making the film experience in a video game. And I love the similarities I could actually make between our talk about what it was like to play Metal Gear Solid for the first time and say, oh my God, video games are starting to play like movies. And then when I sat down and played Uncharted 2 for the first time, and I was like, oh my God, video games are movies.
Nathan Drake is handsome. He's charming. He is talking with the player. Basically, if you're in the middle of a lengthy climbing sequence, Nathan Drake will just kind of say to no one in particular, like, "Oh, my arms are killing me." There was a conversation between the character and the player.
Yes.
Nathan Drake was pretty much the anti-Master Chief.
Yes.
Especially at a time when people were getting a little sick of Halo.
And the anti-Lara Croft in a lot of ways. Like, Lara Croft's so confident, so sort of just like this James Bond superstar.
In jeans, though.
Yeah, in jeans. Amy Hennig said, no, let's make a character who's up against the wall at all times while playing the game. Sure, he's able to mow down hundreds of people, but you feel like he's sort of like doesn't know what he's doing. He's not confident. He's like, holy shit! How do I get myself out of this crazy ass situation?
Wait, can I do my Nolan North impersonation?
Sure.
No.
It's always like everything's like slipping from under his grasp, and that's really kind of how you feel as the player while you're going through this, and nothing more is. Oh my God, that train just from the beginning of that game, that train sequence.
Do you know how hard it was to make that train? Took so much work. The PlayStation 3 was very esoteric hardware to program for. People, I remember a programmer said once that programming for the Xbox was like teaching a class of 20 B students, and trying to program for the PlayStation was teaching 100 kids that were either A+ students or failures. Just nothing would behave, but somehow you could get the average to work out.
And yet that sequence it's perfect. It's incredible. It's unbelievable. I recently, watched a video of it again. It's so smooth, and it's so, they just figured out platforming and cover shooting in such a seamless way. And then, of course, so then we move on, to Uncharted 3, and at the same time, when after the success of Uncharted 2, the team split off into two. One went off to work on The Last of Us, and another team went off to work on Uncharted 3. Now, Uncharted 3 came out, had really good reviews, did well, definitely was kind of considered a step down, I think, from
highly
Uncharted
advanced
2.
Swarming bug technology.
And sand tech.
Good sand
That
was a big deal during that time.
Journey, Uncharted 3, yeah. It was
Spec Ops: The Line also boasted impressive sand tech.
So, but The Last of Us was worked on, led by Bruce Straley, the director, and Neil Druckmann, creative director. Straley was worked on Gex Enter the Gecko and Gex 3 Deep Cover Gecko, classics.
Not that great. not a good precedent.
Druckmann had been working on Jak 3 and Jak X Combat Racing.
Better.
Yeah. And he also wrote comic books for Uncharted and Last of Us, and he wrote a graphic novel I'm very interested in called A Second Chance at Sarah, about a guy who makes a deal with a demon to go back in time and save his dying wife who fell in a coma upon the birth of their son. I don't know. Sounds very Last of Us-y.
Yeah.
Just very dark. And, man, that game, Jake.
Now, here's the thing. The tone of it kind of... A lot of people talked about that this ushered in and kind of embodied the dad gamer era of action games, where between that, BioShock Infinite, I'm sure there's a bunch of other examples, the gamers were getting older, and they were also getting more aware of kind of the tropes and the damseling of women, and the idea that it's not really it's not about rescuing the princess to get a kiss and some cake, but still gamers want to feel like powerful and protecting of like something they care about. So Last of Us had Joel, this older, gruff, like warrior, protecting Ellie, this surrogate daughter figure, who also was like kind of self-independent, and they did a lot of amazing work with AI with her. But it was a different kind of power fantasy. It was more somber. It was more depressing, but also beautiful. The very things that made the PlayStation 3 hard to program for also made it a beast at lighting techniques and environmental design.
Major motif of the game is Life Goes On, which if you've played the game, you definitely get a big taste of during the giraffe sequence, which is one of my favorite sequences in the game. Absolutely just breathtaking. And also, I have to say, the whole fungus thing is based on an episode of Planet
that we
Earth.
all saw.
Yeah.
We all saw that
Loved
fucking crazy thing with the zombie ants.
The zombie ants, where they eat the fungus and the fungus takes over. And they made, well, what if that was with humans? Brilliant idea. And honestly, I have to say, I was so zombied out by the time Last of Us came out, and it was literally the only thing that could have possibly made me want to have like a 20-hour experience. That was done by a voice actor, by the way. That was
clickers, man. Fucking clickers.
Voice actress Misty Lee provided the sound for the clickers, which I think is fascinating. And they used photos from Katrina as reference points.
Yeah,
there's so many interesting little tidbits about how Last of Us came together. It was clearly a work of art made by people in their prime, just brilliant storytelling. And, of course, we just got the announcement for Last of Us Part 2 at the PlayStation Experience. It's probably not going to come out until, like, 2018, but whatever. It's going to be, hopefully something amazing. I really thought that should have been a standalone game, to be honest with you, but if they make something great out of it, I trust them at this point.
Yeah.
And I have to mention, too, Uncharted 4, which came out this year, actually started with the mass exodus in 2014 of Amy Hennig, Justin Richmond, who is the game director, and a voice actor who's supposed to play Sam, the brother of Nathan Drake, all announced they were no longer involved in the game, a thing that's very ambiguous, and I want to find out more about, as I'm sure we'll know more about why that happened as we go on. But they left, pretty much they scrapped everything, and the Last of Us team, Druckmann and Straley, took over. And that game, again, if you want to see the PlayStation 4 pushed to its utter limits graphically and with gameplay, my God, that game is a spectacle. I love it. Boy, oh boy, is it, and storytelling, and incredibly filmic. And
there's something to that. I don't know what it is, but something about really good graphics on a machine that you thought you knew the capabilities of. I don't know why, but there's like a weird paternalistic sense of pride when you look at the little PlayStation box and you're like, you're doing that. You're go, little man.
It's so amazing. And of course, Amy Hennig now is working on a new Star Wars game, which I'm very excited to see the outcome of.
So shit, they're good.
Yeah, they're really good at it. So, and they keep putting out wonderful new stuff. And I mean, what's almost more exciting than a Last of Us Part 2 or what we just got with Uncharted Part 4 is whatever the new IP is that they are probably working on right now. Because
for PlayStation 7.
Yeah, exactly. For PlayStation 7 in a decade. But man, every time they decide to make a leap and try something new, it works out like gangbusters. So more power to them. And I hope other devs and creators are also taking a note from them, and especially other producers and business side of video game companies are taking a note from them and saying, hey, we got to let the creators be creators.
That's just give the people that love the thing they make enough money to make the thing they want to make.
Yeah.
And speaking of enough money to make the thing they want to make, we need you guys to leave a review on iTunes.
Please.
Tell your friends. Go on social media. Pick if someone's talking about a subject that we've covered on the show and you remembered a fun fact and you're like, oh, actually Mark Cerny invented Marble Madness at age 17. You can be like, where'd you learn that? You'd be like, Wizard and the Bruiser. And they'll be like, that's a terrible name for a podcast. You'll be like, I'll send you a link anyway, friend.
And then they're like, why's your penis out of your pants? You're like, oh my God. Oh my God, it's like one of those dreams. And then it turns out to be one of those dreams. What we're trying to say is rate and review us on iTunes. We're already we're doing great on the rankings, and that's all because of you guys. We're slowly moving up.
And the
at
second
an
you let it,
astounding rate.
you slow up even a bit, we will plummet back like Noble Icarus.
Will
So
immediately
keep it up.
plummet. So please keep listening, and please rate and review us on iTunes.
Holden's wearing shoes.
I got
You
shoes
did
finally.
that.
I went
You
and got
did that,
shoes,
people.
and it's the winter, so I really needed them. Holdenators Ho on Twitch, Holdenators Ho on Twitter.
Follow me at BestJakeYoung on Twitter, and check out the Drawfee channel on YouTube, where I sit in and goof around with some very talented cartoonists. I think you'd like it.
And Megan, thank you so much for joining us. Woo! All right, have a good night, everybody.
For more shows like the one you just listened to, go to cavecomedyradio.com.